This is the Shared Practices Podcast, Season 2, Episode 7. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lowe. I am so excited to be getting into the meat of valuations. So this season, I feel like the one skill that, despite kind of everything I'd read everywhere and the podcast I'd listened to, I didn't have a good gut feeling for how to value a practice. So this episode with Hunter Smith, next episode with Dr. Hunter Smith, we're diving deep. If you listen to podcasts at like 2x plus, this is one you'd want to slow down because you're going to have to digest this, maybe listen to it multiple times. There's a lot to take in. This is awesome. Also, I'm super excited. We have a new sponsor, Formlabs. They are a 3D printer company, and they're not just for dentists, but they have a whole dental division of their company. And you might recognize them if you've seen the Netflix documentary, Print the Legend. Awesome documentary. Formlabs is a really cool company to be working with. I'm very excited to get my own 3D printer here coming up. So it's going to be good. In addition, I was able to get a promo code out of Spear. So you'll hear that in the ad. Sorry, it took a little bit longer, but we finally got it. Okay, without further ado, here's the interview with Dr. Hunter Smith. Okay, I have with us today, back again, Dr. Hunter Smith. Welcome back, Hunter. I really appreciate you coming back on the show.
Thanks, man. Love to be here.
We recently got to meet in person in San Antonio at your leadership. Let's see, acquisition. No. Tell me the full name of the summit that we were at.
Yeah, we termed this one the Dental Ownership Summit. We really tried to gear it towards first-time dental owners primarily, but we talked a little bit about how to help existing practice owners. But we titled it the Dental Ownership Summit.
Well, and it was really a blueprint of how to acquire a dental practice, and it was awesome because literally season 2 of my podcast is systemization and acquisitions, and you had Costes and Luna and Howard Ferran, who talked on systemization, who talked on acquisitions and ownership. And then you and Will just knocked it out of the park on a step-by-step. Here's what to look for. Here's what to do. Here's what we recommend. This is how to acquire a practice. So you guys basically did better than I could ever do my whole season of my podcast in a 2-day ownership summit. So if you guys are doing this again, which it sounds like it might be a possibility that you're doing this again, I highly, highly, highly recommend that our listeners jump on that next opportunity. And so we'll announce it. I'm more than happy to publicize and share with our audience your event.
Yeah, so I think, I invited you down there for that reason, because I think your audience and your listeners, the two go hand in hand. You're kind of doing a blueprint roadmap towards ownership, from the very beginning, maybe still in dental school even, and kind of what we were trying to put on there was bringing those world-class business minds to help you get into ownership. It kind of morphed into an acquisition summit in a way where we primarily focused on buying a practice because a lot of the people there do feel like that's the best way to get into ownership initially. But, I think our two audiences there would really benefit. I wanted you there so I could say, hey, Richard's got the Shared Podcast or the Shared Practices Podcast to help you have a roadmap to ownership, kind of what we're talking about here with a manual and speakers to kind of supplement each other. So, yeah, I think they would, your listeners would really enjoy the content there.
Absolutely. The only thing that was a bummer was that because the Army still owns my life, I wasn't able to show up for day 1. And I didn't even know until the week before that I would be able to show up for day 2. And when I got there, they were like, well, you can sit in Howard's seat because Howard Ferran had been there the previous day. I missed him. We kind of passed in the night. And so having worked for Howard and done the podcast with him, I just stole his badge and it was great. I got to sit next to Dr. Luna. I wanted someone to turn around and take a picture, but I didn't know if that would have been appropriate, but
should have texted me. Done it.
I should have. It was great. Just sitting there in the back of the room next to Scott Luna wearing Howard Ferran's badge. I felt like an imposter, but it was fun. And then afterwards, we went and played some top golf, and there's like an acceptable sucky at golf level, where you're like bad at golf but not embarrassing, and then there's like embarrassing bad at golf where you can't even barely hit the ball. And I unfortunately am in that second category of embarrassingly bad. So I just wanted to hang out with you and Will and some other guys that were there, Jonathan Van Horn, and had a great time making a fool of myself. And if I ever own 5 practices, then I'll start learning golf. That's my commitment here.
There you go. You got too many kids to grow up with right now. My pregnant wife almost beat me, so don't feel too bad.
Yeah, she was good. She was really good. No, that was a ton of fun. Thank you again. So without further ado, we will dive into today's topic. So I want to take this from the start of, okay, I'm now in the market to acquire a practice. I've got a couple years under my belt. I've got some money set aside. I'm ready to find a practice to buy. And I reach out to some brokers in the area where I want to settle down. And they send me back a Proforma. They send me back basically these documents describing the financial status of the practice. And sometimes it's a couple years tax returns. Sometimes they're kind of incomplete. They'll have some other data or questionnaires filled out. And I actually get these emails all the time from listeners that want me to take a look at some practices. And I kind of look at them and tell them the best that I can, like, oh, I see a problem here, there, or the other. But I think you've got a way of looking at these and describing these and working through these that really puts some good perspective on it. So let's start from the beginning. So what would you look at first if you got this data from a broker?
So the very first way that I describe a dental acquisition, in particular, when you're doing the evaluation stage. So in an acquisition, you're buying a patient base as opposed to a de novo / startup model where you essentially buy the location. So since you're buying the patient base, you need a firm understanding of the patient base and the systems and staff that are in place to service that existing patient base. So evaluating a practice is both, unfortunately and fortunately, an art and a formula, with a formula on the front end to kind of establish a acceptable price range for the practice.
Okay.
One of my big pet peeves is, a broker will put up this practice is worth $548,000, 50 cents. I mean, it's extremely specific, right?
Sure.
On the practice price, and that there's no such thing as a practice price. There's a range of acceptable, numbers that you can pay for a practice, because our industry does have a big margin in the right kind of practice. So from that formula, the mathematics, you can kind of establish that practice range, and that price range is based on just the financials of the practice as it currently exists. Another pet peeve is people that, and brokers, if you're looking at pro formas from certain companies, AFCO, Paragon, dual representation brokers, they really like to do certain things with the pro formas that you need to really watch out for. So
they're trying to make it look good to sell the practice.
Yeah, exactly. They work for the seller. I mean, and they claim dual representation, but it's a very, very tricky thing when you can't really serve two masters. So you need representation on your side or a better understanding of what you're looking for. So
okay. Well, and let me ask you a quick question, just for people who are new to this. What is a pro forma? What should be included? And if something's missing, should you be asking for that? What do you expect, and what does that mean to someone who's never even heard of a pro forma?
Yeah, so the practice pro forma is basically an information guide that the broker or the transition company is going to put together for their practice to kind of advertise it. It's basically like looking on Zillow or some other real estate website
it's like the listing.
Yeah. It's a listing. It's exactly what it is. And sometimes they'll have an evaluation in it and an equipment list and that kind of things. It doesn't include a whole lot. And just a brief rundown, if they want to write this down, what you're going to need is a profit and loss or income statement for at least 2 years. A lot of people say 3, but 3 is kind of looking back pretty far because you're kind of in the middle of a year usually when you're looking at these things. So
yeah, that's the other thing that I find frustrating or confusing is I'm like, oh crap, this is only half the year, and then I've got a full year from the previous one. So trying to do the math and think about it the right way, it can get a little tricky if you're not plugging it into some sort of spreadsheet.
Yeah, exactly. So the profit and loss statement is going to give you a breakdown of both the income, the revenue of the practice, and where you spent the money. Other things you would need, and that I really, really harp on, is a production by ADA code report. Every practice management software, if they're digital at all, runs it. It's never included in a a practice pro forma.
Yeah.
Um, I'm looking at a slide that says breakaway. It's never included in that pro forma, and you're always going to need it because it tells you what's happening to that patient base you're buying, what kind of codes are being completed on them, what they're used to, how big the patient base is based on the number of profis that are occurring in the practice, how many periodic exams are done. So they never include it, and it's one of the top 2 or 3 things that I think really, really needs to be in your repertoire of items to review. Payroll report, very important to know who's getting paid and how much. Fee schedules of any in-network insurances, and a UCR, which is a usual and customary. There's another usual, customary something. UCR
Rate.
stands for get rate, something like that. Your fee, as if everybody was a fee for service person. If you had $1,000 and that's how much your crown was, that's your UCR fee. If Delta Dental says it's worth $818, your in-network fee for that crown is $818. You need both of those fee schedules. And then an adjustment report from the practice management software, which is going to show you write-offs and show you doctor courtesy credits. It's going to show you new patient specials, that kind of thing.
Okay. So let me go over this real quick. So you get the pro forma, and then these are the additional reports that you would ask for automatically, or only if you're interested in the practice? Like, do you feel like you can't even know if you're interested in the practice unless you get this additional information, or do you feel like you can tell from the pro forma enough to then decide if it's worth it to get these additional reports from them?
I don't really feel comfortable without these reports.
Okay, so these
and
are,
I think if they took them to an advisor, if you got the pro forma and you liked the way the practice was or something, and you took you're a first time buyer and you took that pro forma to a representative that was going to help you with the buying process, they're going to ask for it on the front end. So,
okay, so let's go over those again.
Yep.
So there's the pro forma, which you're going to get. That's their listing. Then
it's going to have an adjusted income statement in it usually.
Okay.
And the first thing you're going to say, I think, is the P&L, the income statement, profit and loss statement,
Sure.
which are all kind of terminology for the same word. Get the actual one prior to their adjustment, so that you can actually adjust it the right way, because they sometimes get kind of creative on that. Yeah.
Okay. So the pro forma should include a P&L. You want the raw P&L, not their doctored P&L their way. You want to look at it your way.
Yes.
So you could request the original. How can you tell if it's been adjusted? Are they all adjusted automatically?
They're adjusting them automatically. Yeah, they'll have little ways that they'll show you like an example of a real one, and then show you what they're adjusting out, and then the adjusted one, and an explanation for why it's adjusted. But the coding is all weird, like what they're putting in certain places. So you need to get as raw of a P&L, something that the business owner would have turned into their accountant so that he could do their tax return.
Okay. So the real deal. Okay. So you're already, even in that pro forma, you kind of have to dig a little deeper. So you ask for the real P&L, and then you ask for the other reports that you asked for. You said payroll report, and that would break down how much is going to the front desk versus the assistants versus the hygienists, versus the dentist versus the dentist's wife, or husband, whoever that is. So that shows you kind of who the money is going to. And then
I would want that, basically who they like, whoever's doing their payroll.
Mm-hmm.
If you can get the W-2s, for instance, that would be huge. Just, you want to know who's getting paid how much, because sometimes they'll list in the pro forma, Betty works 24 hours a week at $10 an hour. So you're expecting her to make 240 times 50 weeks, or, whatever that she would typically work, and make $12,000 that year. And then you look on there and she made $17,000 on the W-2 because she was scheduled for 24, but she worked a little bit extra. They got bonuses that, so they list sometimes in those pro formas what people are making, verifying it with the payroll report, either from their accountant who pays, if they pay it online, however they pay their employees, try to get the actual payroll report.
Well, and the other thing with that, and I guess sometimes they'll bundle on the P&L different positions together. So it's just kind of like staff costs all lumped into one. And you can't really know, which areas are more profitable or draining more or whatever if you don't have it broken out. So
that brings up another point. If you're looking at that pro forma or the income statement and someone asks you, hey, what's the staff percentage? Because you've read on Dental Town or somewhere that staff percentage should be 30% or less. And then you look and it says staff wages and it says 28%. You think you're in really good shape. But on that income statement or on that payroll report, you'll see, oh, wait a minute, they still got payroll taxes. They still got a 401k plan. All that's included in the staff percentage. So get a true payroll report to see what your actual staff costs are.
With benefits and retirement and insurance, everything all bundled in. Don't let them separate it out, basically.
Or if they do, be able to recreate where it's coming from on that payroll report. Just a way to double check what you're being told. Okay.
And then paired with that payroll report, you said production by ADA code /provider. So
yeah, provider. So it's every practice management software runs it. Basically what it does is, and it's really hard to communicate to a broker who doesn't run this a lot, exactly what you want. I would write down those exact words and give it to him. Production by ADA code by provider.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to break down. If you and I are two dentists in a practice, I would have a provider code in the practice management software. You would have a provider code in the practice management software. If they run that, our provider production reports, it'll say, I did 600 periodic exams and 30 crowns and 40, class twos or whatever. Yours would have however many class twos you did, blah, 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 broken down by the individual code, not just category.
Does it give money associated with that or just the code number, like the total number of that procedure?
Yeah, it'll do both. It'll do all the above. If they're entering collections appropriately, then it'll even give that.
Okay.
So it'll have, I did 40 periodic exams. They totaled X amount of production. They totaled X amount of collections.
Okay. And I'm thinking about, this is important not only if there's two different providers, but it's also important to break out hygiene production versus doctor production,
Exactly.
and to be able to pair those up with people and who's producing what and when. So this would be, I kind of like to break things down into like baby steps for people who are doing this for the first time and it seems overwhelming and they don't know what to do. So if you haven't done this before, this is just an exercise. Let's go bug some brokers. So number one, contact a broker and ask for a pro forma. And then number two, see if that P&L has been adjusted, which it probably has, and see if you can get a raw P&L or an unadjusted P&L. Ask for a payroll report and a production code or production by ADA code by provider. And if you can do that, then you're going to have a much better, there's still a few more, but just try that. Just go out and bug some broker and try and get that information from them and try and look at it. Because until you look at it and until you have all this data and then you sit there and say, okay, now what? It's going to be hard to kind of follow along. And obviously this is an audio format and it's not ideal for breaking down numbers and reports and things like that. But just the process of doing it, I found, has been really helpful for me to understand what I need to learn more and what I need to understand more. So then the next reports that you said a fee schedule and an adjustment report. So the fee schedule is kind of that UCR, what are they charging in comparison to people in the region and other dentists? And then explain the adjustment report a little more for me.
So the adjustment report, when you say, if I did $1,000 crown, or let's say we did a crown on you, my UCR fee was $1,000.
Okay.
But I was in network with Delta Dental, and they only gave me $800 for a crown. So since I'm in network, I have to agree to accept that $800. So in my practice management software, I would complete my UCR code, which would be $1,000, but I would only expect to collect $800 of that. What the adjustment report's going to show is that $200 adjustment to make the balance equal 1,000. So what that adjustment report's going to show you is any changes that occur on the ledger of the patient. So it's going to show you things like insurance write-offs. If you're running new patient specials, it's going to show charity cases. If you needed that $1,000 crown and the doctor decided that you get it for free, they write the $1,000 off. It shows up on the adjustment report. It's also going to show things like late fees, positive adjustments to it. So if you owed me $1,000 and you didn't pay me on time, and now I charge you $25, now you owe me $1,025. The $25 is going to show up as a positive adjustment on the adjustment report for a late fee. So what that's going to tell you is, hopefully, if they're doing it right in their practice management software, it's going to show you your insurance write-offs, how much you're writing off, so you can compare it to the number of patients that are on that insurance, so you can determine whether or not that's even a insurance you want a credential with when you buy the practice.
Does the adjustment report break out by insurance, the adjustments, like by different plans? It'll tell you, oh, we adjusted this much because of this plan, or is it just bundle all of it together?
It will, if they've entered it into the practice management software as having different codes there.
Okay. So garbage in, garbage out. If they've done a good job, then you're going to have better data. And if they've kind of mucked it up or just didn't do it right, then you might not have perfect data.
Yeah, but for the most part on insurances, they do.
Okay.
And most dental offices at least track it a little bit, where you're going to, if nothing else, this adjustment report's going to explain any discrepancies that may be between production and collections.
Okay.
So it's just another way to check what's actually happening in the practice. Because if they're saying they got $1,000 or $100 or $1 million of production and they collect 800,000, you want to know if they're like not collecting what they should, and then that would be shown off as like a write-off that wasn't based on an insurance, or if they were in network with a couple of insurance companies, if they did a bunch of charity cases, if it just kind of explains what's happening in the practice. And that's what all these reports do when they're looked at as a whole, versus what happens too often to young dentists and first-time owners is they get this practice Proforma, they get the listing, and now they think that contains the information they need. And that's just a snapshot into a whole book that makes up a practice evaluation acquisition. I describe it as the words that you're hearing are the terminology, the overhead, the production, the collections, all of that's terminology. They're words, they're a new language. They're in a report, which makes up the chapters. Well, the chapters make up a whole book. And the whole evaluation acquisition process is that book. The reports are the chapters. So they're showing you one chapter with the practice Proforma and telling you to write a book report. These other reports help bring the whole picture together.
Okay, so let's dive into that. I really like that analogy. Let's go back into the language. So this episode of the Shared Practices podcast is brought to you by Formlabs. Formlabs is the industry leader in SLA 3D printing. What does that mean? What that means is that you can actually print surgical guides in your office for less than $20. The best part about this is that Formlabs understands what a dentist actually needs from a 3D printer. You need to be able to push a button and it works. It prints. The cost, the ease of use, the reliability, the accuracy, the service plan, the resins, everything is there. This isn't one of those early adopter, let's work out all the kinks for this company as we use this. No, they've been doing this for dentists for years now. With Formlabs Form 2 printer, we're now at the no-brainer point where it just makes sense. Case in point, I saw the other day on Facebook a dentist who was considering getting a 3D printer because he wanted the implants that he was sending to his oral surgeon to come back just a little bit more predictable in their restorability, their angulation, their position. He wanted to print his own surgical guides. He happened to go to his oral surgeon's office, and there in the front area, the oral surgeon has a scanner and a 3D printer. The Form 2 by Formlabs. That's why I say this is at the no-brainer point. If you are placing implants at all in your practice, This needs to be part of your workflow. To request a free sample, go to formlabs.com/shared practices, and Formlabs will mail you an example of one of their surgical guides. Formlabs, high-resolution 3D printing in your dental office. Okay, so let's dive into that. I really like that analogy. Let's go back into the language. So you mentioned production and collections, adjusted production. What does it, what should we be looking at in terms of, oh, this practice says they produced this much, they actually collected that much, but then there's also this adjusted production. What is the number that matters to you the most, or how are those different if someone doesn't understand the difference between those?
Yeah, so by far the most important of those numbers is collections, because that's actual money that you have to spend.
So you could produce $2 million worth of dentistry, but if only $1 million's coming in because every system is broken and you're on the worst insurances, it doesn't really matter what you produced.
Yeah, exactly. I can make my UCR fee schedule or UCR fee for a crown $2 million.
Sure.
If I'm only going to expect to collect 800 from Delta Dental, then I'm going to show tons and tons of production, but I'm actually not collecting any money. So when you're evaluating, you're buying the business, you're buying the cash flow and the patient base. Collections is what matters. What production does is kind of describe what's happening in the practice if everybody paid the same fee.
In an ideal world where everything was collected and it was fee for service, if everything was fair, you would get this amount of money. But it's not, and we have to accept insurance and all these other things, and our collections aren't perfect. So we actually bring in this other value, the collections.
Yeah, because you hear reported numbers like your staff percent, again, to use that as example, should be 30%. Well, if you're a heavy PPO, HMO, Medicaid office, you're doing it with a bunch of volume with little bitty fees. So your staff percentage most likely is going to be higher than that. But if you looked at it based on what your production is, you may be properly staffed because your fee for that service was actually way higher than what you collected. You just wrote off a bunch.
Sure.
So you need to understand it's just another way. Again, it's just another thing that describes the practice. You want to know what the production is, then you want to know what the adjusted production is, which is the money that you would actually collect. So to go back to our crown analogy, if my UCR fee for a crown was $1,000, that's my gross production. If I cut a crown on you, if Delta Dental says it's only worth 800, then I'm only going to expect to collect 800. So that's my adjusted production number that includes the write-offs. And then if you pay me $780, then my collections is $780. You still owe me $20, so I have accounts receivable of $20.
Okay. So gross production to adjusted production, you've subtracted insurance and any other discounts or charity work. And then adjusted production is the theoretical. I could collect 100% of this if our collections were perfect, but they're not. So now there's some value lower than that. And then the difference is the accounts receivable money. That accounts receivable is like money that is owed to you that in theory is supposed to come in at some point in the future.
Yes. And, we want our collections to be 98% or more of adjusted production. Fee-for-service practices, if you're looking at those, usually have a lower than that because lots of fee-for-service practices are real relationship-based practices where somebody comes in for a crown and they've been a patient there for 30 years, so they say, just bill me. And you send them a bill, and now there's a lull in the actual production versus collection. So in my experience, I've seen fee-for-service practices in particular have a collection percent that runs a little bit behind adjusted production. If you're a heavy PPO, you really should be real close, or you got insurance AR issues, which just means you're not harassing the insurance companies enough for your money. So you want those to be as close to 100% as possible. 98 is kind of an ideal number. Anything less than 95, they got collection problems in the office.
Do you see that as an opportunity, or do you see that as a problem for the buying dentist?
I don't, when I'm evaluating a practice, I don't necessarily factor that in.
Okay. It's not a big deal to you. It's just kind of, it is what it is.
If we got big time collection problems in the practice and the staff percentage is really high, so we're expecting these people to be good, to represent, representative to the amount of money they're making, then yeah, that's a red flag. It's kind of like, well, they're well paid, but potentially lazy and not doing their job, or just don't understand the correct systems.
Sure.
So I don't think it's a plus or minus. It's kind of scary to see it. And it doesn't really get me, it's an opportunity to maybe do better, but it's not a evaluating factor in my opinion.
Okay. It's not a major player in the overall valuation.
Yeah, unless it's just stupid out of whack, like they're collecting less than 90% or something of what they would expect. And
okay.
Then the accounts receivable like crazy and patients are not used to paying. So,
yeah. Okay. Adjusted production, is there a range that, like, if they're a heavy PPO, you'd expect adjusted production to be this much less than gross production, or is that really not a relevant ratio or percentage, not something you really care about?
Not super relevant. I'd like this. What I typically see is about 30% that you're writing off. If you're about 50-50 PPO, fee for service, and your fees are in the right spot, then I would kind of expect 30%. If it gets closer to 50, that's a practice that's a lot in a lot of networks with PPO insurances and maybe some HMOs. So you're going to have to really, really produce to make up that. And it says a lot about the market potentially.
Okay.
And then if it's less than 10, then they're maybe in network with Delta Premier or something, just the best of the best PPOs. So
okay, great. No, this is really useful just to see, when you see these numbers, what are red flags and what are not that big of a deal, and what are kind of normals and outliers. So this is great. Yeah. Okay, so now you've got the gross production, the adjusted production, the collections. You can start to look at the P&L and the overhead. How do you like to break down overhead and fixed expenses, variable expenses, normalized overhead? You kind of talked about that in your presentation. So what does that mean to you, and what do you start to look at?
So this is really this is information that's glossed over in a lot of Proformas, and if you just met with the broker. It's very, very important when you're reviewing these practices to not only understand what the overhead is, but specifically what's the fixed versus variable expenses. And this honestly is one of the very, very first things I'll look at in a P&L is what are the fixed expenses. And it makes sense if you think about it because they're fixed, right? There's no way to change those expenses in the practice except increase collections of the office. So you now have to grow the practice to affect those fixed expenses. And when we buy a practice, we try to buy it based on what it currently is, not what we can make it. So the fixed expenses matter a whole bunch. Big time fixed expenses include the staff cost. Sure, you can fire somebody, but if you're buying a practice, you don't necessarily want to have big over system changes right on the first day. Facility cost, the lease, if it's a transferable lease and you're going to expect to pay $5,000 a month of rent, you're going to pay that regardless of whether you collect $1 million or $100,000. So we want to understand what those fixed cost expenses are and what percentage of our collections they make up, or what percentage of the overhead they are, because it is a gigantic red flag to have a high percentage of fixed expenses. The variable expenses, on the other hand, are things that fluctuate month to month, like supplies and lab bills, the marketing budget to an extent. Those things we can change. We can negotiate our supplies. We can pick better labs. We can have supply formularies to control those once we buy the practice. Those are items that we can actually improve by being a smart business owner. Fixed expenses, we have to increase the revenue to do so. So understanding the difference in those two, especially identifying on the profit and loss statements what's fixed and what you can't really change, is a very, very important evaluating factor when you're looking at practices.
Okay. So when I think about this, I think of actually how banks like to evaluate us. So when you go to a bank and you want a big loan, they look at your lifestyle and they say, what's your mortgage and your car payments and your student loan minimum payment that you have to pay every single month? They look at our fixed expenses in our life that, no matter how much money we make, aren't going away. And if that ratio of what we have to pay every month versus what we earn every month is a bad ratio, then banks don't want to lend you more money because they know you're living too strapped. So this totally applies with the practice. I like Costas's simplified version of overhead of the 30-30-10. So 30% would be staff costs, 30% would be the other practice expenses, 30% would be doctor profit or doctor production earnings, and then 10% would be owner profit. It's kind of a nice, easy round way to look at things. But when you look at fixed expenses, that would include staff, you said facilities, insurance on the practice. Is there any other expenses that you would clump in with fixed expenses?
Those are kind of the big ones. You mentioned Dr. Costa. So he separates staff out of, and it's really just a way to describe what you want how profitable you want to be in a practice. That's estimating basically a 60% overhead,
right?
With 40% going to the doctor, with 30% in terms of wages and 10% business profit. So it's a very broad overview. We're separated, more specific.
Yeah, and so for some people, they've listened to his podcast and they've looked at all this and they understand. But for other people, this is like their first exposure to even thinking about how percentages of overhead fit into the big picture. So I'm just wondering what goes into fixed expenses and what's like a acceptable range of fixed expenses and what's like a red flag for you on a percentage of the total overhead as fixed expenses.
Yeah, the two that I really look at most are the staff percentage, which what we talked about earlier. Everything that goes into paying the staff.
Okay.
If you buy them scrubs, if you pay for their health insurance, if you pay their wages and their payroll taxes and their 401k matches, everything that it costs to have that staff member and all the staff members goes into your staff percentage. When it gets over, and we're a little different. This is super region, not super, but fairly region specific. Dr. Costas says 30%. He's in a higher cost of living area than I am.
Right.
Here in Arkansas, it's closer to 25.
Okay.
But no matter where it is, over 33%, I start to get worried. And also, the second one I look at really hard is the lease costs. I call it facility. Really, facility has everything lumped in, like utilities and repairs and stuff. But if just the lease costs alone account for greater than 8% or so of the revenue of the practice, then that's something that's very, very difficult to change. Obviously, you have to increase the production or the revenue. So those two combined, when they get over 40%, just staff and just the lease, there's 40% of your money gone right there that you can't really
change,
do much about. So when those fixed expenses are over 40-ish%, that's a red flag, and you need to understand you're giving up profitability to keep that staff and to be in that location.
Okay. No, that's awesome. Okay. So fixed expenses, red flag past 41 total. Variable expenses, is there a percentage that you start worrying about? And I guess this starts going into individual line items on the overhead, that if this one's high or this one's low, maybe there's an opportunity versus maybe things are just inflated.
You look at that more as an opportunity thing. So again, we're looking at a big picture thing. So I harped on us getting the production report. So if we look and they're not doing a ton of crowns and the lab bills are 5%, say, you're like, well, wait, what are they spending their lab bills on? Whereas if you look at the production report and they do 100 crowns and they're 5% lab, you're like, okay, that makes sense. That they may be getting a good cost. They just do a lot of fixed work. Or fixed type restorations.
Sure.
So the variable expenses, specifically the lab and the dental supply cost, I like to keep the combination. So I look at those two as a combination because they play off each other depending on what procedures are occurring in the practice.
Okay.
So it's not bad necessarily if they're a big percentage of the overhead and you're buying the practice. That's areas that I think you can improve.
Okay.
So that's not necessarily a red flag like the fixed expenses were. But once you get into practice, it's actually the opposite. If you see a practice that you're evaluating and they got 4% dental supplies and 4% lab, and you're sitting there now with variable expenses of 8%, you can't really improve that. Whereas if they're sitting there with 10% supplies, 10% lab, I feel like you can go in and really improve that. So the sweet spot for me is kind of 13. the combination of the two.
Okay.
It's usually something like 7% supplies, 6% lab. Both of those can be improved upon. Ideally, you like dental supplies of around 5. The lab's more representative of what's happening in your practice, but you want to keep that under 13. So if it's over 13 when you're evaluating your practice, that's kind of not an advantage. You don't really say I can pay more for the practice now necessarily, but it's something you look at and you're like, okay, there's improvements that I can make to this practice. Whereas if it's 8, you're like, okay, now I have to do exactly that good to recreate this.
They're running a really tight ship. And if I start buying what I want and this, that, and the other, that could creep up pretty quick.
Yeah, I'm costing myself money based on what I would expect in the practice and I'm trying to buy. So yeah, I like to keep that. You like to see that at 13, even when you're kind of running the practice. We got practices that do less than 8%. If someone was going to buy one of those practices, they'd have to do really, really good to recreate it. So that's kind of everything is variable. Utilities you can negotiate to an extent. Office expenses are things like the practice management software. If you move from Dentrix to Open Dental, you're going to save money there. So
okay.
Getting into the individual line items would really take a lot of time, but
sure,
fixed expenses versus variable, it's important to understand the difference. We want to keep our fixed when you're evaluating the practice. It's a red flag if it's over 41, and the combination of dental supplies and lab, if it's over 13, you feel like you can do an improvement. If it's less than say 10 or so, they're going to have to play real hard to recreate that once you buy the practice.
Okay, awesome. So then you mentioned as well normalized overhead. So what do you mean by normalized overhead?
So normalized is basically what the Proforma is going to tell you they did when they adjust the profit and loss statement. An adjusted profit and loss statement is theoretically normalizing the overhead to what normalized overhead is. The overhead when you take out any discretionary items. So if the doctor was running his disability insurance through the practice, that's not something that you're going to have to pay for when you buy the practice. So you should pull that out of the profit and loss statement.
They're doing
things like
CE trips to the Bahamas or other things like that.
They're paying their wife or husband $40,000 a year to be an office manager and they never step foot in the building. That kind of stuff is discretionary. It can come out of the profit and loss statement that they hand their accountant at the end of the year and say, hey, file this with the IRS because I only want to pay taxes on this much. Some of that is discretionary, not actual dental practice expenses that you can pull out. So when you normalize the overhead, you remove the discretionary items. The Proformas try to do that. They just don't do it very well for the most part. So you normalize the overhead yourself or with an advisor to better understand how much you're going to pay to run that practice when you buy it.
Okay. So, and that's, I think, I can't remember if it was Dr. Luna talking about the tax advantages of being an owner and being able to play the game. So playing the game, meaning if you shuffle money around and do things through the practice, then you in theory are paying less taxes on these things because you're buying them as the practice rather than paying taxes on them and then buying it yourself. So you kind of have to undo whatever game they've played with their taxes, and it can be a little tricky and it can mess with the overhead. And if their broker didn't do great due diligence or is trying to, fudge it in the direction they want it to go, their normalization might not be the normalization that you want.
Yeah, and they get super creative on that stuff. I've seen things such as, the national average supply cost is only 10%. So this practice had 15% supply cost. So they just take off 5% of the supplies and say that they normalized it to a national average. Well, if the practice had a CIRIC or something like that, some kind of digital scanner and milling unit, they might have 0 lab bills because they code their CIRIC blocks as dental supplies. So, but guess what they never do? Add it back in a normalized lab amount or something like that. So you really got to watch what they're normalizing. They'll normalize out anytime they pay a staff or a spouse member or a spouse. But if the spouse was necessary to the function of the office and would need to be replaced, if she was the actual office manager, then you can't normalize that out. You have to account for you have to pay somebody to do that job. So
yeah, there was a practice I was looking at for a listener the other day that the practice is the dentist's husband was the office manager, but wasn't taking home a salary, and the doctor was only taking 20% home of the overhead or of collections. So it's like the two of them, between the husband and wife, were only taking home 20%, and that's not factoring in replacing the husband.
yeah.
And so that was a big red flag for me of sure, maybe there's other things that we could normalize back into their salaries, but overall there's not a lot of meat on the bone left in this practice.
Yeah, so normalizing would not only include removing discretionary items, but it also would mean adding back in anything that you would expect to have to pay. So you normalize for your situation. So maybe it would be normalizing for the doctor's situation to take out his spouse.
Sure.
Well, it's fine. It's not an off expense. But if they work in the practice, then you have to normalize back in a staff member to do that. So they get in those pro formas. It's another reason to not just go based on those and go to the bank and say, I'm ready to buy a practice. You have to look at those other reports that we talked about to see how that office actually functions on a day-to-day basis so that you can understand what the actual costs are going to be. So that's what normalizing the overhead is.
Okay, so I get the impression that you and Will did a lot of this yourselves because you understand this at a pretty deep level. Or am I mistaken in that? Did you guys hire someone to like normalize all this for you and to dissect this for you?
No, so I actually, the very first practice I ever bought, which was 2 months after dental school, I did exactly what I'd recommend not to do, which is I took the practice pro forma to the bank and said, hey, this is how much they said the practice was worth. Give me some money and let's get it going. So it worked out just because I got extremely lucky with the being able to increase the revenue.
Okay.
But the actual by going in and working full time and the doctor staying on with me. But if the doctor would have left the office, the expenses that they reported in that were not near accurate. So what we've done over time is just learn from our failures and mistakes and our existing practices to kind of know what to look for. So we've done our understanding of it is just simply based on owning 6 practices.
So now, do you hire someone else currently if you were to acquire another one, or you guys just do it on your own?
We wouldn't now. We would do it on our own. And in fact, we help others do it on their own.
Okay.
But I think going into that blind as a first-time owner is you can get to a certain point. So I think when if listeners of your podcast are going to be more knowledgeable than, Sandy just graduated over there, but there's still a certain point where you're going to get to where you need other help with due diligence. You need, just talking on a deep level, how to allocate the funds of the practice, where the purchase price is actually being allocated to in terms of goodwill, equipment, supplies, the legal contracts, the terminology. So they're state specific. There's verbiage in there that needs to be in place to protect you. So I think going at it without advisors when you're a rookie at it, first time guy is dangerous, no matter how comfortable you feel evaluating the practice.
Well, and so the what I'm trying to dissect out for people is it would be nice to know enough to be able to look at a practice that's a bad deal and identify it as a bad deal up front before hiring someone to come in and negotiate and evaluate further, and then you realize down the road that it's a bad deal. So my goal in season 2, by the end of season 2, from you, from others, we're going to get valuations, and I'm going to go through this exact same process that I'm going through with you right now of what you look at and ranges and numbers with other guests as well. Hopefully by the end of the season, people can identify those lemons and those red flags. But I also want them to understand who they can reach out to. So like, it sounds like you guys could help people with this. And that's part of what Southern Dental Group does is helping people digest and interpret this information. Is that correct?
Yeah. So basically what's happening right now is there's a couple different ways that you can go about getting help. And it's exactly what you just talked about. You want to be dangerous enough that you can rule out the stinkers. You want to listen to this podcast and me tell you when the fixed percents are over 50%, that practice is not going to be profitable.
Right.
You know that already. So don't go pay a CPA $3,000 to tell you that practice is not profitable.
Right.
On the other side, you got brokers who are representatives of the sellers. So on the front end, you're kind of at a loss. You have no representation for yourself. And then you hire these people and they get you to the sale date. But then after they leave, you're a practice owner and you don't know what to do. You can hire a consultant, but they don't really know where you're at in the process of the transition. So what we do is more a la carte services where I don't mean to pitch the company here, but just trying to understand exactly how this process works. We will work with you on what's the first step, which is doing the actual acquisition, which is the formula, which is the art form of arriving at a purchase price for you. And then we can stick around if you want us to do the contract negotiations with CPAs and attorneys that we trust and that we have worked with and know to make sure you're getting good representation in that way. And then if you wanted a full service transition with us, we will actually stay in the practice as an advisor for the first 6 months to a year and do things that are very, very transition specific, like the first couple payrolls, implementing the office manual, getting insured with the insurance or getting credentialed with the insurances, those kind of things. So right now, there's not currently anything that exists out there that kind of is a full service buyer representative for the full transition process. So that's kind of what we do and why that's kind of what our seminar is about, is teaching people how to get dangerous, how to get, where you can identify those practices so that when you bring them to us or your advisor, whoever you do choose, that you can save money there, not going through this multiple times, and then really feel like you have a practice that we can move forward with when you present it to us, because it's just frustrating for everybody to go through negotiations and have to tell them that the practice that they've now fallen in love with is not a good one. It's way better if we can teach people to know what they're looking at.
So that's awesome. No, and I appreciate you kind of being able to run through this. And I also want to kind of figure out, I want people to have reasonable expectations for what they're hiring people to do. So if they need someone to, and to be able to ask for the right things. So I had a buddy that's going to be on another episode. It might have already aired by the time this one airs, or it might be after this one. But he hired an attorney who he thought the attorney was going to do the valuation and the negotiation, and like neither of those things happened. And so is this unbundling and normalizing overhead, is that something that's typically done by the accountant or a buyer's broker? Not that usually exists in dentistry, but who normally does this?
Yeah, it's tough because that's another problem, is you don't know who you're hiring to do what and how far they're going to get you.
Right.
That's why we tried to cater again, not trying to be pitchy here, but trying to cater our services.
You're so pitchy, man.
I'm sorry. Trying to cater our services.
I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Oh, I understand. To cater our services more towards an a la carte kind of a menu-based selection where you know exactly what we're going to be helping you with.
Right.
Because right now you would need to go to the dental CPA, for example, and say, hey, I'm doing a practice evaluation. Can you help me normalize the overhead? Okay, then you pay them to normalize the overhead. Then now I need you I need an attorney to do my associate contract review. So right now you're all kind of all over the place. What we want to do is bundle the services to an extent where you select the service that you need, and then you know what you're getting and what to expect from there. And any attorney or any accountant that we suggest would be someone who's vetted by us, who we know is going to treat the buyer and the doctor correctly. So
sure,
it's just another way of helping. One thing that Southern Dental Group and really everybody that we work with, which is why the summit was so successful, the ownership summit, everybody that we work with and ourselves, our main goal was keeping on-site dental ownership. think it's important for the industry. I think it's important for new grads trying to fight these student loans. Get out and be an owner as opposed to an associate making 120 a year and take control over your business. But to do that, you have to take the appropriate steps. So we're trying to really support on-site ownership and helping guys get into ownership, guys and girls, and then be successful once they get in, because it's a changing world out there in dental practice, especially for the solo doc, with pressure from basically every angle. So
okay, no, and that's exactly like, that's why we get along. You know, we're on the same page, and it's awesome to see what you've done via Dental Town and via these other things to encourage that and keep that alive and support our generation of dentists who needs a lot of support and help to get through this process. So let's see how much further we can get, maybe in another 10, 15 minutes, in terms of valuation. So we've talked about some terms up front that we need to understand. And I'm really glad we understand normalization over overhead is one separate thing. Now, valuation is another separate thing once we have a normalized overhead.
So what? Go ahead.
No, so I was going to say, what's the next step? After you have an overhead that's normalized, you've got all these other reports that you can piece together and get a true picture of the data. Once you have the real data, now what do you care about, and how do you value that practice?
So let's go back to our analogy. We're doing, now we understand the terms, we speak the language. Now we have the chapters of the book, and we've kind of put them in order now with the reports, with the normalizing the overhead. So now we have an actual book, and we've read the book. We understand the reports and what the words mean. The actual evaluation process is writing that book report out and giving a review of the book. So when we do an evaluation, we're trying to arrive at what is a good purchase price or purchase price range for me, the buyer. It's buyer specific. You and I, if I taught you exactly how I evaluate practices, you and I are going to come up with different values. But as long as it's within that fair range, and as long as it's representative of your needs as a buyer, then it's the appropriate practice price.
So why would we come up with different values if you had taught me? Dive into that a little bit further, because here's the latest amazing discovery I've stumbled onto on speareducation.com. There are a set of videos that are patient education videos. And unlike your generic, here's a crown, here's a root canal video that you can find online or buy, these videos are designed to help you co-diagnose and increase case acceptance. So here is Dr. Frank Spear explaining how to use these videos.
Lower crown, and you think that you also want to bleach your teeth upper and lower. And you write all this on a piece of paper. And now you walk to the patient and say, I've done my examination and here's what you need. And you hand that paper to the patient, and you know as well as I do that as soon as you do that, there's an anxiety going on because you're wondering how the patient's going to respond. What's this patient going to do when they see $5,990? Instead of doing that, the alternative is very different. The alternative is, let me show you what I found. Let me show you what's going to happen if nothing's done. That's all the conditions videos. And then let me show you what's the benefits of treatment are and the options for treatment. That's the procedure videos. And then you turn to the patient and say, how would you like to proceed?
Patient videos as a tool to increase case acceptance requires a specific type of video and a specific approach. Spear has nailed this. To explore these and hundreds of other amazing online videos, go to speareducation.com and request a guest pass. I'm excited because we finally got a deal for you with Spear. So you can mention the Shared Practices podcast to get a 30-day guest pass. And then when you decide to sign up for the annual subscription, mention the promo code LOW200, LOW200, for $200 off your annual subscription. Dive into that a little bit further, because Derek Williams, when he was talking to me, mentioned some things about how you value practices based on the individual doctor and how that was really important for him to understand.
Yeah. So like we talked, very, very first thing that we talked about when you're evaluating your practice, it's both a formula and an art. So I can teach you and anybody how to arrive at a practice purchase price range. Now, it's going to be a really big range, and what that range is based on is just the financials of the practice, just the reports and the cash flow of that practice, based on what practices are selling for in the area, kind of a comparable sales type thing with a home, based on the financials. So the 3-bedroom home is worth X amount in this area. Well, a practice doing $150,000 of cash flow a year is worth this amount in this area. So that's the price range. But there's an art to it as well, where there's individual factors that go into what makes that practice better or worse than another one. The first and most important one is the buyer needs to be able to replicate the production of the practice. So say, for instance, the selling doctor does ortho. And me and you are both looking at this practice, and you do ortho, but I don't.
Okay.
So when you're evaluating that practice, you get to say, oh, he does $100,000 of ortho a year. I also do ortho. I get to leave that cash flow in.
Sure.
If I look at it, it's like, I don't do ortho. I'm going to lose that production. So now I can't value that practice as highly as you can. It's buyer specific from the very first evaluating factor. So, and I'll list, there's 8 or 9 of these evaluating factors that are really important to me, that make it buyer specific and practice specific. The demographics of the area are another important thing. And even more so than that, how badly do you need to be in there? If your wife is saying, hey, we're living here no matter what, then that practice suddenly becomes worth more to you, not based on the financials, but based on, hey, I have to give up a little bit of financial money or a little bit of cash flow here because we're just going to live in this area. That's the way it is. The location is an evaluating factor, the size of the patient base, the staff overhead, the hygiene percentage, even down to things like the technology that's in the office. And what you'll notice in the order that I listed that is it's things that are hardest to change to things that are easiest to change. If you can't reproduce the production, you can't reproduce production. If you're a brand new grad and the office is doing $2 million and you can't do $2 million, that's tough to change. It's going to take years. If they got a cone beam in there, the practice is worth more, but if you really wanted a cone beam, you could just buy it. So the technology is a evaluating factor. It's nice to have, but it's not necessarily a huge swing in what you can pay for that practice based on that price range. So
list those traits again in order, because now that I understand that hardest to change to easiest change, I want to hear those again.
Okay, so ability to reproduce the production, that's a little misleading, because if it's something just like they do extractions, and I don't, you go take a weekend extraction course and now you might be able to. But that's more on a scale of like, I can't do $2 million of production because I'm not fast enough.
Sure.
Or I don't do ortho and I can't go learn ortho in a weekend.
Okay.
So ability to reproduce, the demographics of the area. Anytime you're talking, you can buy a real stinker of a practice. If the demographics really support growth and it's a quasi startup, then that might be a strong reason to pay a lot more for the practice. The location, you want to have visibility. You want to have it be on a major highway, highly traveled. And if it's back on a back street, can't really change that. Staff overhead percentage, that goes back to our fixed cost. The recall base size, how many patients are actually in the location. Never ever, that brings up another thought of mine. I hate the term active patient. Every single person that I've ever met that's a consultant defines that word differently, and they're consultants. So they're the ones teaching people what active patient means, and they all define it differently. So what's more important to understand how big the patient base is the recall base. Look at the number of profis that the office does on our ADA by production by provider report. Look at the number of perio maintenances they do. That's the actual people that are coming in every 6 months. So that's an evaluating factor. How much of a percentage the hygiene department makes up. That's very important, because if it's something like 15 to 10% hygiene, that's a really heavily worked patient base that's got a lot of dental work being done that you may not be able to replicate because you're not that aggressive of a diagnoser.
Okay.
Vice versa.
No, go into this a little more, because this is something that George Riri was talking about, and he was saying that you see a low hygiene percentage, and that can mean one thing or another, and you see a high hygiene percentage, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing? What do you see when you see that number?
It's a represented, basically, how do I describe it? So yeah, just like anything, there can be too much of a good thing and too little. So we want to see our hygiene department kind of in the 20 to 30 range.
Okay.
As a percentage of the revenue. The reason is basically a doctor can do 3 times as much on one patient as a hygienist can, based on revenue. So the ideal mix is 75-25 doctor hygiene. So when you start seeing that hygiene percentage of revenue creep down below 20% or so, then you're thinking, okay, that's a smaller patient base than what the revenue suggests, because this doctor's doing either everything that he can on the patient. He's not referring a lot out. He's aggressively diagnosing crowns. He's, their recall systems are not great to get patients back in for hygiene. So you're kind of looking at, now, if you're looking at over 30%, that's kind of a good thing, because that means that there's work that's maybe there to be done.
Okay.
But what you need to be careful of, you also need to look and make sure that the perio percentage is not something crazy because they're doing scale and root plane on every single patient, and that's not your diagnosis. You wouldn't be able to recreate that production, because you're going to tell your hygienist, hey, you can't scale and root plane every single new patient, regardless of whether or not they have periodontal disease or not.
Okay.
So, but in general, a favorable hygiene percentage is a really, really important trait to look at on a practice. If you see somewhere 30 to 33, 35%, and you're thinking, okay, that's a patient base that's not worked over, that I can go in and maybe do a little bit more production out of if I don't refer so much out, and if I diagnose, I'm not a single tooth treater, as opposed to if you're looking at a practice it's 20 or 18% hygiene. Now you're thinking, okay, well, what's exactly happening here? This patient base is not near as big as the revenue says.
Okay. So let me see if I can rephrase this just so I make sure I understand. If you've got a low hygiene percentage, it means one of two things. It means either the doctor is keeping everything in-house and maybe aggressively treatment planning, or just doing a lot of procedures in-house. And so it might be harder for you to replicate what they're doing, or maybe they've kind of tapped into and done a lot of the work that needs to be done already.
Yes.
Or it could mean that their recall systems aren't very great, or that they're not doing, maybe they don't have a very efficient hygiene program. So it could mean one of those two things. Is that correct?
Yeah, it could. For your second point, they're a limited exam office, meaning they're an emergency office, basically. They're not seeing a lot of recall patients. So they're really reliant on patient who saw them 2 years ago to call with a broken tooth and they do a crown on them.
Okay.
As opposed to someone who comes in every 6 months and you notice, hey, your big, huge filling's about to be a crown.
Sure.
You need to do it now. So,
okay. So a low hygiene percentage means one of those two things, and you need to go in and figure out which one of those two it is, because if it's low because their recall system isn't great, then maybe you have the potential to tune that system up and get patients back in the door. So that could be an opportunity, versus that doctor who's really cranking and getting the most out of each patient. That's more of a red flag.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. And then on the high end, the hygiene percentage that's high means that you have potentially patients that the doctor is just kind of doing patchwork. He's putting amalgams on there, just fixing things and just getting people along. And so maybe there's a ton of undiagnosed or patients that just haven't moved forward with their treatment plan. A lot of potential work to be done, and that's kind of that gold mine of a low hanging fruit. A lot of just simple crown and bridge and good dentistry that needs to be done for these patients. And so that's an opportunity, versus the practice that has a high hygiene percentage because they're being really aggressive and over treating perio, or maybe messing with the codes and doing things they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, or completing the periodic exams as hygiene as opposed to a docket code. So
okay.
it's In general, to speak in general terms, it's better to have a favorable hygiene percentage, a higher hygiene percentage,
Okay.
because it's more likely that they're a referral doc who's just sending a bunch of stuff out or patchwork than it is for them to have a heavy perio base. And on the other end, also, when it's below 20%, it's more likely to be due to no referrals, aggressive treatment, small patient base than it is just the recall system to be broken. So, in general, a favorable hygiene percent is probably 25% is an ideal number.
Okay.
And anything 30 to 35 when you're evaluating a practice is a really positive evaluating factor.
And that number, from that initial listing, you might not get that number from their initial pro forma. That might have to be a combination of the staff or payroll percentages in combination with the ADA code by producer. So you might have to put that number together. It might not be apparent right up front, but that's a super important number to be looking at. And it's something, for me, hearing that's like something I can go to and look at with these practices and kind of be able to write off those lemons versus dig deeper when this is a good opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, when I'm looking at a practice, the most important traits that I look at when I say, okay, this is a good practice for me or for anybody really, is four things: highly reproducible profit. So we got to be able to do the work.
Okay.
And then we want it to be as highly profitable as it can be, a big number.
So that's like just the overall, like there is plenty of meat on the bone. The dentist is taking home a high profit percentage already in the overhead right now.
Yeah, just in general profit. So I would much rather buy $1 million practice that had 400,000 in profit than I would a $500,000 practice that had 250 of profit. Same percentage. I'd rather have the 400 if I could reproduce it, because it's a bigger amount, right? Because the whole goal is to make more money. So in terms of that's not the whole goal. I mean, we treat patients, right? But from a business side, you want to be as profitable as possible.
Well, and that's great, because I was just saying percentage, and you're saying, yeah, percentage is good, but overall that actual cash flow is more important.
Yeah, that's the number one trait for me: high reproducible profit. And the second one is right where we've been talking about, a favorable hygiene percentage, because I want a large recall base that I can do my dentistry on. A large recall base means that the profit is not as variable. It's not as dependent on patients breaking teeth or getting decay, because they're coming in every 6 months. So now we have a stable patient base that's got a stable revenue base. Third, I want the fixed cost to be under control. And fourth, I want the environment to support growth, both internally and externally. So I want to have an office that really pushes for internal referrals. And I want to be in a demographic that allows me to efficiently market. So if I have those four things: highly reproducible profit, a favorable hygiene percentage, my fixed costs are under control, and the environment supports external and internal growth through marketing and recall systems, that's a really strong practice. And if you check mark all four of those off, that's one that I feel like you can go immediately take to myself and Southern Dental Group Transitions, or to your CPA attorney of choice, and say, I'm ready to pursue this practice.
Awesome. Oh, that's a perfect kind of summation of what is really hard to figure out by looking at these on your own. So I appreciate you really breaking that down. We're kind of getting to that hour point, so maybe I'm going to have you back if you're willing, and we can talk about actually taking some of these numbers and leading to a valuation or a purchase range. And then also, I kind of wanted to dive into that demographics that you were talking about what does a favorable demographic look like to you, and just kind of location and other things that you would factor into that rating. So maybe we can have you back. Do you think that'd be possible?
Oh yeah. I think would be a really great episode, is if we did a kind of a now you understand, and we do the actual book report. We find some practices that we look at, and we talk about how to arrive at that practice price range, and then we'll make a theoretical buyer and see, okay, where can this theoretical buyer pay on that price range for the practice? And then if those two numbers match up and it matches up with the whatever the listing price is, then that's a practice that person can buy. So, and then we'll do it the other way too, a bad one.
Awesome.
That they shouldn't buy. So yeah, I think that would be a really good episode. There's so much content that you can cover on dental acquisitions. It's a big topic. It's going to be a good season for you guys on the Shared Practice podcast. This is very, very important. Acquisitions are the best way to get into ownership early in your career because that immediate cash flow is so important. So yeah, it's a big season. Everybody needs to listen to every episode, and that's definitely one we should do during the season.
Well, thank you. This has been awesome for me. Like I'm so excited for the season because every single interview I do, I learn a ton, and I understand things I didn't understand before, and hopefully our listeners are getting that same additional perspective and your way that you do valuations and the things you care about, and they can piece it all together. So next time we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to go in and actually put some numbers to the test and see if we can find some good practices and what we would make an offer on those practices. So thank you so much, Dr. Hunter Smith, and for not only inviting me out down to San Antonio, being on the show multiple times, and sharing your expertise from doing this multiple times on your own and helping others do it. I really appreciate it.
Hey man, thanks so much for having me. I love what you're doing. It's similar to what I'm doing. We're trying to help guys get into ownership, be successful in their careers, and we keep putting good information out there. I think it'll really help your listeners and the industry as a whole. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Hey, take care, man. Okay, that was awesome. Thanks for hanging around, you guys. I really feel like Hunter's giving us some super valuable content of how to actually value a practice and decide if it's worth it to pull the trigger. Stick around. We're going to hit up valuation from Hunter and from other perspectives over the next month or so, as well as some other topics. But I don't think we're done with this. I think there's more to be explored. And I want you to be sick of hearing about valuation by the time we're done, that it's so familiar and so something you understand so deeply that it's kind of second nature. If you found this valuable, you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review. I think we're almost at 50, so please be the one to bump us over. We'll talk to you next time on the Shared Practices podcast.